Hello everyone, this is the Oneromancer giving you yet another reply to Nightsphere the Gnostic. In here I'm going to be replying to his Just War Theory video where I propose, or at least explore, consequentialism and ask the question of whether or not Celestia is even a good general. Without any further ado, let's begin. Starting with consequentialism, it can essentially be boiled down to the ends justify the means. Now I understand that this can sound very scary when you're talking about warfare. The system almost seems to be based around the idea of efficiency, as in what ends the war faster, or you're also probably thinking about ways it can be abused. I bring this up because it's usually dependent on how it is used, and I'm also going to bring up in a moment ways it has worked. You may argue that you need sort of ethics to using consequentialism in warfare, and I don't disagree with you, but it depends on what system you're going by and what you're doing. An example I will bring up in a moment is an example that consequentialists will use even though it technically defies the Geneva Convention, and you probably know what it is. An example of consequentialism in the show would be the Season 3 opener. Specifically that it would appear that the main point of saving the Crystal Empire, or at least the biggest point for Celestia, was so that Twilight would learn her lesson. Sure, it may have been a majorly important point to save the Empire. However, I'm also sure if it was really that important to Celestia, she probably would have directly intervened herself, rather than just use Twilight to do it and then have her learn a lesson. So in a way, you can look at that as an example of consequentialism in the show. This is because Celestia could have just walked in and probably saved the day herself, but instead she chose to maybe pull a risk, maybe not, depending on how you look at her, by sending in Twilight to do it. Here she killed two birds with one stone. Twilight learned one of her lessons and was one step closer to Ascension, and the Crystal Empire was saved, whereas in the other one, the Crystal Empire would have just been saved, even if it may or may not have been safer, again, depending on how you view Celestia. Now, I'm going to step into headcanon territory for a moment, so please forgive me, but originally it's possible that Celestia and Luna did not bother helping the Empire until they figured out it had an impact on the rest of Equestria. Think about it. Sombra, by the time they tried to get rid of him back 1,000 years ago, already had enough time to establish his rule, make all the inhabitants of the Empire his slaves, and set all those traps. It's entirely possible that they may not have gotten to him as quickly as they did, if he never had an impact on the rest of the land to begin with. Now, this isn't to say that benevolence never played a role in here. Obviously, taking out a dictator would be a pretty awesome thing to do, especially if you're saving people, but it may not have been as urgent if he ruled a place that didn't impact the rest of Equestria. Now, this is morally ambiguous, but that is true with war in general and consequentialism. You'll find if you study military history and military philosophy. After all, very rarely, in fact, almost never in war are there really any happy endings. However, although you can argue for moral ambiguity in Equestria, it's not totally there. Even with this consequentialist worldview, saving the Crystal Empire, stopping Sombra, and happening to come out as the hero, whether it was part of your intention or not, really isn't that hard to do. Sombra's kind of an obviously evil villain. Or he's set up that way. It's really not that hard to come out of that looking like the hero no matter what you're doing, as long as it's against Sombra, for the most part, because we know our heroes would never take it too far to the point of moral ambiguity. However, real life, it's obviously very different. Issues can get very complex, and arguments from decades ago or hundreds of years ago still last today, and neither side really comes to a resolution. Consider, for example, and you've all probably heard of this, the atomic bombs. This is why I said the ethics of these issues are tricky, because technically, dropping atomic bombs in modern day would have broke the Geneva Convention, I'm sure. However, back then, there obviously was no Geneva Convention to break, or at least if there was a Geneva Convention, the atomic bombs were obviously not under it. So I will pose this to you as a question. Would you drop the atomic bombs? Now, I'm sure most of you have already thought about whether or not you would do it, and whether or not it was ethical or not. But here, I want to try and show you the double-edged sword nature of most warfare-based decisions. First, ask yourself if you would do it if you were there in 1945 voting for or against it. You could drop the bombs, which had relatively unknown side effects, and you would be hitting civilians in the process. However, if the bombs worked, then the war would end without needing to invade the Japanese mainland via Operation Downfall, killing about 250,000 people, albeit in a questionable manner. I would say that consequentialists would side with this option. Then there is the other option, which is Operation Downfall. This was a conventional invasion of the Japanese mainland, as said before, but the casualties were estimated to be in the millions on both sides of the battlefield. There was also the Soviet Union, which had declared war on them on August 9th. and probably would have helped out from the north. The downside is that the Soviets probably would not have given up any land that they claimed, and would probably have split Japan just like Germany. On top of all this, the invasions probably would have all but destroyed Japan, but it would have done so with less questionable methods by comparison. I would think that of the two, the just war theorists would have supported this side. However, there are more questions to ask here, including in the context of the modern day. 1. Would the bombs actually be covered under just war theory back in 1945 because there was no consensus or rule on how to use them? And also, would this apply to other weapons of war now classified as WMDs, like chemical weapons in World War I? 2. Do the civilians become valid targets in a total war setting, seeing as they are actively part of the war effort? This isn't just about World War II, by the way. This can be applied to any war setting in which total war is enacted. And number 3. This essentially sums up what I was saying. Is it better to kill off a smaller number of the population with a morally questionable superweapon that would end a much bloodier and more destructive war right then and there? Or should you not use the superweapon and fight that more bloody and destructive war, killing many more people and likely devastating the entire country you're invading? But in doing so, you know that you did it without doing anything exceptionally morally ambiguous within the context of war. Remember that part. That's important. Now, I did not pick this scenario to tell you what side I'm on or whether or not I would have chosen to drop the bombs. I pose these questions to you, but they should be applied to any war, or you can think about them in any war. And I did this to illustrate a point, more or less. You can choose to reply to them if you want, but that's not really what I'm looking for. The idea is, I just want you to think about them. And now we're going to explore my second question, and that is, if Celestia is a good military general. No doubt she would need this if she really is fit for handling the case in Syria, as Nightsphere said, just in case things just go south. For this, I'm going to use Sun Tzu's The Art of War, or at least a couple passages from it. My ultimate answer, though, is that, while Celestia is a brilliant leader, very powerful, and good at manipulation, I would say that surprisingly she is not a good general. But that's just me. Now, Celestia actually does have a good trait that you find in a general, and that is benevolence to her subjects. As it says in The Art of War, Chapter 10, Terrain, Section 25, it says, "Regard your soldiers as your children, and they will follow you unto the deepest valleys. Look upon them as your own beloved sons, and they will stand by you even unto death." However, by some interpretations, and this may be a stretch because there are many ways to interpret Celestia, and many ways, perhaps even that seem more likely than this, I'm not sure, and that she may be guilty of recklessness, at least in regards to some tests and situations. As it says here in Chapter 8, Section 12.1, there are 5 dangerous faults which may affect a general. Number 1, recklessness, which leads to destruction. No doubt Equestria would be in an abysmal state if Twilight had failed her Crystal Empire test, rather than Celestia just going in there herself just to ensure it was done right. Now, you can view that as a sign of recklessness, such as Celestia not accounting for margin for error. However, you can also turn that around and say, well, of course she did. She knows Twilight well enough to know that she would make all the right decisions. But then you can go back again and say, a lot of unexpected things could have happened, unexpected or unexplained factors. Even Twilight so much as tripping on a stairwell could have radically altered everything. So you can keep going back and forth with this. This is of course not going into what I call omniscient morality license theory, named for the trope. And that is that Celestia knows the outcomes of all events and will influence everything to make the best outcome happen. Now, of course, this video assumes that she isn't like that. Anyway, to me, an effective general is benevolent yet brutal when he or she needs to be. And you can see that, even though she's got the benevolence down, she doesn't quite have the strategy part down. And I'm surprised at this because she's really good at reading and manipulating people. In the invasion of Canterlot, the Royal Guard have all assumed their posts. Now, granted, this also assumes that Celestia is the one commanding the Royal Guard. I would assume that she is, but she manages to get taken out by Chrysalis. They seem to be in complete disarray, and they really couldn't handle the changelings despite being at the ready and aware that an attack was coming. I would even argue that they could probably see the changelings massing outside the shield, and probably would have had more than enough time to get ready. To add insult to injury, the main 6 were able to hold their own. And I say this is something that adds insult to injury because the main 6 have no military training. You would think that because they aren't even specialized in fighting, that someone who is specialized in fighting, let alone an army of these people, would have been able to hold their own so much better. You could argue for numbers, but you have to figure that there would be a shit ton of changelings for this. I guess it's not totally improbable. Now, a real-life example of this, and I know I may get some flack for this, or I may get some praise for this, depending on what side of the Dixon line you're on, and that is American Civil War General William T. Sherman. Now, I'm aware of possible accusations of racism that are directed to him, but otherwise, he hated war and the philanderization thereof by the press, media, and the younger, more ignorant generations and politicians. And also outside the battlefield, he was essentially a gentleman. He was very merciful, very lenient, especially when negotiating war. And aside from the possible racism I mentioned earlier, he was a very nice guy, from what I've heard. On the battlefield, though, it was almost like you were fighting a completely different person. He was very effective and very brutal. Even today, his infamous, or at least in the South it was infamous, March to the Sea has caused some Georgians to think of this man so evil that he is second only to the devil himself, whereas the North will tend to play him off more as a hero. Now, William Sherman's philosophy of war was very interesting. As I mentioned earlier, he actually hated war, but you may ask, why was he a general? Well, I suppose his mentality was, I'm going to war so that you don't have to. And he was pretty damn good at it. The other part of it that was interesting was, he wanted to convince you. No, actually, he wanted to show you that war was terrible. He didn't want to just say it to you. And the reason why is because saying it was awful didn't really do anything. The press still flanderized it, and the young people still romanticized it into something as heroic, or secretly glorious, or whatever. He didn't like this. So, what he would do is he would burn towns, he would destroy railroad tracks, essentially make war difficult for everyone. And he would make sure that you at least saw it. And the reason why is because he wanted to show you that war was awful, so that when people said war was awful, you didn't think of it in that romanticized sense. You thought about it in the, holy shit, yes, this is really awful. And to paraphrase him, he wanted to make it so awful that several generations would pass before anyone even thought of appealing to using war as a solution to problems. And no matter how you look at his March to the Sea, it worked. It did end the war faster. He did what he set out to do. He fought the Confederacy, and he broke the spirit of the South, and that is what he was aiming to do, no matter how you look at the man. Now, in Nightsphere's video, you may remember that Celestia won his little tally between Celestia and the Western governments. This makes sense. She is written as a deity and has larger-than-life qualities, but at the same time, she's only really placed in situations with black and white morality in them, such as true of the nature of the show. You can argue leniency, and you can argue that there is some deeper moral complexity there, but it's ultimately played off as more or less black and white, and you'll probably find yourself agreeing with Celestia in most cases. So it should be no surprise to anyone that she won that little tally. The thing is, though, Syria is not a black and white issue, as you probably figured. In the US, just to give you an American perspective, there was a debate as to whether or not it was even worth stepping in. Even though Assad is regarded as a terrible person, and he's used chemical weapons, which is definitely a war crime, the problem is, sometimes removing those guys often has a worse guy come into power. This does not justify the crimes against humanity that Assad has committed. Not at all, and I still think he should answer for them. There's also that, even if we attack Assad, the rebels that we would be helping are most likely going to be militants, including militants aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. This is because most of the moderate factions, so I've been told, have all either disbanded or have been killed off. And this is just the warfare stuff. This is just one side of the issue. I'm not even going to get into the political people involved. My last point kind of ties in with whether or not Celestia is a good general, and it is use of a little via negativa. What I'm getting to is, not only is Celestia not really a good general, if you ask me, I would also contend that she isn't really a war god. And to do this, I'm gonna compare her to 3 war gods from 2 different pantheons, and that is the Norse war god Tyr, and the Greek war gods Athena and Ares. Again, this is sans the omniscient morality license theory. It should come as a surprise to no one who knows mythology that she is not anything like Ares. Ares is the god of war, but he also emphasizes the murderous aspects of war, the visceral parts of it. And obviously, Celestia isn't a visceral murderer, as we've seen. She isn't really that violent either, unless she needed to be. However, she does have similarities to Athena and Tyr. Specifically that Athena was wise and strategic, and Tyr was also, in addition to being a war god, was also a god of justice. Now, Celestia, we can argue, is totally wise and strategic. Maybe not in the military sense, but again, there's a lot of leeway there, so you can argue both ways. There's also that being a princess and being the moral compass for Twilight, the main six, and probably most of Equestria, she probably is involved with matters of justice and is considered to have fair judgment, seeing as she seems to have a pretty good PR rating as well. However, there are instances where she isn't like them, and this is kind of somewhat an important part of war, and that is, she can't really hold her own in a fight that well. Let's be honest, fighting is a big part of war. You kind of have to be good at it, and you kind of have to be good at commanding others to do it. In the Invasion of Canterlot episode, I would contend that, again, assuming she was in command of the Royal Guard at that time, they didn't seem to be handling the situation that well, even under their own command, and I would expect a military force to be a little more competent than this. There's also that, in situations where she has gotten into a fight, she has lost, and in fights where she has won, they were often with someone. Like, for example, when they defeated Sombra, Luna was obviously there to help. Not to say that she couldn't have faced Sombra on her own. We obviously don't know. You can raise arguments for either way. There's a lot of leeway with these arguments I'm presenting here. I should probably say as an end of the video disclaimer that I'm not saying consequentialism is the best way to approach war. It is a way to approach war. There are many ways of doing it. Just war theory is another way. And I'm not necessarily saying that consequentialism is the best way. There are many ways to look at things, some ways are better than others. But it seems that with war, everything is a double-edged sword. Consequentialism is obvious because there are many ways to use and abuse it, for right or wrong. Anyway, just keep that in mind. Anyway, that's the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Until next time, this is the Oneiromancer. Have a nice day.
There's a fork in the road in front of me, at the crossroads of identity. The devil is standing to the left. He says either way they both lead to death. And the